Well, it's straight up 7 o'clock, so we want to go ahead and begin our program. Hello and welcome. As the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings you the Fall of Afghanistan with guests Dr. Medea Afzal and Stephen Tankel. My name is Marianne Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and it is our honor to welcome you to tonight's program. Before we begin, I'd like to share some of the exciting World Affairs events we have planned for you this fall. Registration is now open for World Quest. This is our fun dinner and trivia evening, and this year with a French theme, where you can enjoy a carefully prepared French dinner and a night out with friends. You don't have to have a team, everyone's welcome, and you can register on our website. So bring your berets and join us for an evening of fun and delicious food. We also have upcoming our International Awards Luncheon with guests Vicki Hollub, the CEO of Oxy, and billionaire David Rubenstein of the Carlyle Group, host of Bloomberg's TV The Rubenstein Show. And this luncheon is just over a month away, so register early as seating will be limited. Next, I'm so pleased. We have been working so hard over the summer that I am going to announce today that the Council has expanded, and we are now featuring programs not only in the Central Houston area and the Woodlands, but now also in Katy and Sugar Land too. And of course, we will continue to bring you our online programs like our upcoming program called Reading the Tea Leaves, discussing China in transition, and The Art of War in the Age of Peace with Michael O'Hanlon. Next, registration is also open for limited places available for our Global Affairs and U.S. Foreign Policy Institute. This weekly Foreign Affairs series is especially designed for business professionals, so make sure you get in on this series. You won't want to miss it. Next, if you enjoy traveling the world, travel with the World Affairs Council in first-class style. You'll not want to miss our upcoming information sessions as we discuss touring Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco. And don't forget, if you're a student or educator, you'll want to enroll your Student World Affairs Council chapter on our website or contact us via the office. You'll want to stay up to date on all things that are happening for our students and our educators, and educators get professional development. So make sure you register your Student World Affairs Council chapter, otherwise known as SWACs. Also, if you're a young professional and want to mingle with others who enjoy global affairs, check out our website for our next meet and greet and our Global Young Professionals program. And remember, benefits are available if you're a member. So we have individual, couple, family, and corporate memberships, all available at a very affordable price. And we are now enrolling all members for our new fall season. And you can find out about all this and more on our website at wachhouston.org. Now it is my privilege to introduce the Council's Global Young Professionals Program Manager, my colleague, Mr. Jahan Jafarpour, to introduce our guest speakers. Jahan?
Thank you, Marianne. On behalf of the Global Young Professionals at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, we want to thank our two speakers this evening for a wonderful and exciting evening of listening, learning, and interacting. We'll begin with our first speaker tonight. She is Medea Afzal. Medea Afzal is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program, working primarily in the intersection of political economy, development, and security with a focus on Pakistan. She previously worked as an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Maryland College Park. Afzal is the author of Pakistan Under Siege: Extremism, Society, and the State. She has published extensively and writes for outlets such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, and Newsweek, and regularly appears on BBC, NPR, and PBS. She was recognized for her writing on education in Pakistan and named to the Lo Spazio della Politica's list of top 100 global thinkers of 2013. Now, our next speaker is Stephen Tankel, former senior advisor at the Department of Defense and Center for New American Security, and currently adjunct senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. He is also an associate professor at the American University and serves as senior editor at War on the Rocks. An expert on terrorism and counterterrorism, security, and military affairs in South Asia, Dr. Tankle frequently advises U.S. policymakers, practitioners, and members of the intelligence community on these issues. From 2014 to 2015, Dr. Tankle served as a senior advisor at the Department of Defense, where he led a review of U.S. defense policy in South and Central Asia, and helped to coordinate efforts to counter the flow of foreign fighters from South, Central, and Southeast Asia to Iraq and Syria. And tonight, we'll have our program moderated by the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston's Director of Programs, Ronan O'Malley.
Thank you very much, Shahan and Marianne, and thank you very much, Medea and Stephen, for joining us. I know the two of you are always busy, but unfortunately, I'm sure these last few weeks, probably some of the busiest you've ever been with your areas of expertise. You both know the region and the subject, very well, time on the ground there, and obviously, many years of study. Medea, especially with regards to the study of extremism in Pakistan and the region, and Stephen, as an incredible expert with regards to counterterrorism and security policy, and I suppose the efforts we have made in the region for the last 20 years. In light of the solemn anniversary, sadly in 2 days of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and also the rather shocking and sudden fall of the government in Afghanistan, I just wanted to talk about how this impacts the terrorist threat to the United States going forward. Obviously, a lot of it's up in the air. The Taliban are perhaps somewhat different, but some ways not to what they were back in the 1990s and before they harbored Al Qaeda and refused to give up Osama bin Laden, after the 9/11 attacks. But Medea, could I maybe just open with you? Could you help our audience understand maybe the appeal and the allure of the Taliban? And, obviously, some of that, is that ideological? Is it kind of common, kind of cultural, kind of conservative traits? Is some of that out of fear? Or how much of it was just kind of a blowback to an incredibly inefficient and especially corrupt government that was very unpopular in much of the country, especially in rural areas?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me as part of this discussion, and glad as always to share a stage with a virtual stage, in this case with Stephen. I think you mentioned several of the factors that sort of deal with the appeal of the Taliban. I think key to these is an ideological appeal in terms of thinking about who joins the Taliban, right? And so, and the fact that it remains a robust recruiting ground for extremists. In that, I think we really need to think of the ecosystem, if you will, of extremists and extremism in the region writ large. And so the Taliban is able to recruit from many who may not necessarily even be former Taliban. They could belong to groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba and join the Taliban. They could belong to Al Qaeda and join the Taliban. So we really need to think of sort of the pool of extremists who become violent as a pool through which these various groups draw people. So that's sort of one thing to think about. I think in terms of sort of just thinking about how the Taliban were able to take over, in that, I think we really need to look at an array of factors, including the fact that the Afghan army, basically the Afghan security forces over the summer, lost the crucial US intelligence and air support that they had become so dependent on, that they had become so used to suddenly. That combined with the fact that the Afghan government, basically that was, seen as corrupt even by the Afghan, security forces who were fighting, as uninspiring. And as on the losing side, as the Taliban were ascendant and then taking over the countryside, became a government that they were just not willing to fight for, explains the surrenders of the Afghan security forces, especially if one thinks about sort of these 11 days in August where it was really just cities fell like dominoes, if you will, to the Taliban. And I think that really took many of us, honestly, by surprise. I mean, when sort of I looked back, we knew in April when, and really in some ways we knew last year with the Doha deal that was signed, that the Taliban really would not have many incentives to come to the table to talk peace, and they would really try to run out the clock. But we knew when an unconditional withdrawal was announced by the Biden administration, essentially there was, the peace process was going to be moved. And given that the peace process was going to be moved, we knew that the Taliban would engage in this kind of military strategy and try to engage in a forceful takeover. But we expected some resistance, right? We expected the Afghan security forces to resist the Taliban, not all over the country, right? Because the Taliban in many ways had already been encroaching in these rural areas, right? So one of the things we missed in sort of the lack of focus on Afghanistan over the years, in terms of just thinking about sort of the public sort of perception of this, right? Analysts had been noting this, was that they were really in charge of the countryside and creeping up on the cities. But we expected more of a resistance from the cities. And that essentially, as the final withdrawal began, as Bagram was given over in July to the Afghan security forces, that essentially quick succession and quick fall of the cities, I think really has to do with some factors that have to do with the Afghan security forces, less so necessarily the ideological appeal of the Taliban in Afghanistan cities. But there is that element of, a population, part of a population just wanting peace, just wanting this war to be over, and not wanting to lose the tens of thousands of lives that they have lost over the last 20 years.
And Stephen, I want to bring the conversation more to kind of just very recent, time frame and looking forward from here. But just to kind of look over the last 20 years, I think if you told most Americans who are old enough to be alive and remember September 11th, 2001, if you told them on September 12th, we're going to have 20 years without a major terrorist attack on the United States or one of our allies. There have been attacks, but nothing anywhere close to the level of devastation and horror of 9/11. In that ways, really, the United States military intelligence services and our overall, strategies were effective. Obviously, the nation building in Afghanistan, there are many flaws we could talk about. But what do you feel were kind of the core reasons why we were able to be effective and kind of break up, Al Qaeda groups and cells and keep the country relatively safe during these 20 years?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me and for the question, because I think it is very important. With the fall of Afghanistan, I think there's this sense among some that we might have gone back to September 10th, 2001. And that's really not the case. And the reason that's not the case is because our counterterrorism capabilities have evolved considerably over the last 20 years. And those capabilities are a large reason why we've not suffered a major attack. And I was living in New York on September 11th, and I know that we all thought there was going to be another attack, days and weeks afterwards. And for a long time, I think that was the belief. And there have been a number of near misses, and they have owed in part to our expeditionary use of military force, but they've also owed in large part to a lot of the other capabilities that we've built. An intelligence apparatus that is very much geared towards identifying and thwarting threats, that does a much better job of syncing domestic and international actors, right? FBI, CIA, the intelligence community works together a lot more cohesively than it used to. Many people may not be aware. The CIA was tracking at least two of the 9/11 hijackers. They were living in the United States, not under assumed names. And there was no communication between CIA and FBI at the time, right? So we've also, our bureaucratic structures, we've done a much better job of reducing the silos between the different counterterrorism elements within the US government. Now, I think there are still barriers between those counterterrorism elements and other elements of the US foreign policy establishment. That's a different story. CT practitioners work very well together. We've invested enormous sums of money and built up a reasonably robust homeland security apparatus that does not start at the border. We have layered defense. And so it's much harder to get on a plane and fly here and do bad things than it was 20 years ago. Medea, I'm sure, when you've flown back from Pakistan, if you've flown through the Gulf, when you're flying to the US, you go through extra screening, right? When you're in the UAE or Qatar, as opposed to if you're flying somewhere else in the world. We have the type of military capacity, in terms of the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, special forces raids that we've developed over 20 years. And I would say we also have something that we didn't have on the 10th, which is a much more universal awareness of the threat. And so for all of those reasons, I think we have been able to keep ourselves safe. And although when you'd introduced this question originally, Ronan, you talked about, what the terrorist threat looks like now that Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban. Look, I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think anybody wanted that other than, maybe the Taliban and Al Qaeda, and their associates. But it's, because of all those different counterterrorism capabilities, we are much more protected than we were on September 10th. I would also just finally note that terrorism itself has evolved. Terrorists increasingly rely on social media to radicalize recruits. They use encrypted channels to do remote directed attacks. And so in many ways, we have to be more mindful of people here in the United States who may be inspired by those actors outside than we do of people coming in from Afghanistan.
And Medea, just to turn back to Afghanistan in particular, obviously the regional implications as well. But could you talk about the associations you discussed it, briefly earlier between the Taliban, Al Qaeda, have had allegiances and associations for almost 30 years now at this stage. There was the agreement Trump's administration signed last February 2020 was that they would not allow the Al Qaeda to use Afghanistan as a base for attacks upon the United States. Unfortunately, that's something we may or not find out until it's too late. But I suppose, could you just talk in the broader sense of goals of these extremist groups? I know one of the big concerns and kind of controversies with Al Qaeda before 9/11 was bin Laden's idea to attack the far enemy, meaning the United States, as opposed to the near enemy of these corrupt regimes in the Middle East, if it's in Egypt or if it's in Saudi Arabia. What do you think is the kind of ideological outlook for those terrorist groups in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the region, and their likelihood to plan another large attack against the United States?
Sure. I mean, that's an important question. And I think, it dovetails nicely with Stephen's answer as well. I mean, I agree that the American homeland is certainly safer now than it was 20 years ago. And that's certainly a good thing. I would say that the region is probably less safe, or it's probably no more safe now. That the region, meaning Afghanistan, Pakistan, and sort of its surrounding neighborhood, than it was 20 years ago. The goals of these terrorist groups, in some ways, are multifaceted, and it really depends on the terrorist group. There's an ideological underpinning that goes to all jihadist groups, and that is to impose some sort of version of their version of Sharia on the area that they want to take over, right? So that's kind of the local or regional goal, if you will. And then there's the goal to attack the United States. And of course, the US, when it was in, and that's more, that has been more of a goal for groups like ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And then if you think about, obviously Al Qaeda attacked the American homeland, but also thinking about the Taliban attacking US forces and the US allied Afghan government over the last 20 years, launching its insurgency. And now that the US has left the region, what does the Taliban do? I mean, the Taliban don't have an interest in attacking the United States now that the US has left the region. But groups that are associated with, allied with, that share an ideology with the Taliban still do. So one can think about Al Qaeda. And Al Qaeda proper obviously is, sort of a fraction in some ways, or a shadow of what it once was, but that doesn't mean it's gone away. The thing is that with these groups, and I've studied sort of the extremism, and not necessarily just the violent extremism, but just the extremism that kind of underlies the thinking behind these groups. When the groups have sort of a set of recruits to draw from, whether it's ISIS-K looking at disaffected Afghan Taliban or Pakistani Taliban militants, if you suppress one of these groups, another group can come out in its place. So you can't. The way these work is that you can't actually allow any of them, frankly, to exist, but you also have to counter the ideology of these groups. And I've gone into it, I'm sure we're going to go into this a little bit more in a bit, but if you think about the landscape in the terror group landscape currently in the region, you can think about ISIS-K, which, as I said, recruits from disaffected Pakistani Taliban, so the TTP, the Afghan Taliban, and is a sworn enemy of these groups because it's a more hardline version in many ways of these groups. And it thinks, frankly, that the Afghan Taliban is a little bit of a sellout, a group that engaged in a deal with the United States. So it's to even the more sort of extreme right end of the spectrum compared to the very extreme Taliban. And its high casualty attacks and very brazen, very horrific attacks are a testament to that. Then, there are these Kashmiri jihadist groups that target, Indian targets in Kashmir. Think about Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba that operate from Pakistan. There's Al Qaeda, which, intelligence estimates indicate will continue to can regroup faster than we had previously imagined now that the Taliban is in charge. And then there's the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, which has been regrouping since last year. And, we know that hundreds of TTP fighters were released in just last month. In sort of the jailbreaks that happened all over Afghanistan. And they've already increased the number of their attacks. There was an attack just this past weekend in Quetta in Pakistan. And so, sort of a long way of saying that I think the extremism in the region and the landscape of terrorist groups in the region remains intact. And I don't think the region is any safer than it's been recently. I think that, in terms of what the US is looking at, certainly counterterrorism capabilities in the US are strong, but now intelligence collection has become a real problem given that the US doesn't have a presence in Afghanistan. And what does over the horizon counterterrorism really mean for these groups that exist in Afghanistan? The US has an eye into Pakistan, but the eye into Afghanistan just got very, very hazy.
And related to that, Stephen, Obviously, counterterrorism is very difficult anywhere in the world, even if you have a supposedly allied government or not, whether it be the Afghan government or obviously our complications with the Pakistani government. But what are the realities for our counterterrorism measures in Afghanistan now? Obviously, we don't have boots on the ground. We can't have forward observers to direct attacks. Special forces, are a long way away. Drones or airstrikes are far out. How can we, keep track of people there? Do we have to build new assets on the ground, new human assets? And I suppose related to that, at least in the short term, with regards to ISIS-K, Medea mentioned here they're sworn enemies of Al Qaeda and the Taliban. Is there going to be a certain degree of ironic cooperation between the United States and the Taliban to perhaps take on ISIS-K targets?
Yeah, so let me take that last piece first, in that we've already seen, I wouldn't say cooperation, but coordination between the US and Taliban at times in terms of combating ISK, in terms of when Taliban was engaged in combat on the ground with ISK, there was at times US airstrikes that were supportive. We've seen that already. What that will look like going forward, I think, is an open question, but stranger things have happened, I suppose. Medea is absolutely right, and you're absolutely correct that it's much harder now. This was always one of the concerns with regard to withdrawing U.S. forces, was not just, obviously the fall of the Afghan government, although, I will note, just to go back to Medea's original question, or answer, that fall was a long time coming. The poor governance, right, the inability to build an ANDSF that could actually hold territory, rather than just taking it back from the Taliban with U.S. assistance, the inability to get Pakistan, and other countries to see support for the Taliban. All of that, this was a very, very slow motion train wreck until it wasn't. But with that said, the concern was always not just that the government might fall, but that even if it didn't, once U.S. forces were withdrawn, intelligence collection becomes so much more difficult, and it becomes harder to act quickly because time to target is so much longer. And here, we're sort of faced with the tyranny of geography to some degree. In Syria, the U.S. can base out of Jordan, it can work out of Iraq, in Somalia, it can work out of Djibouti, it can work out of Kenya, Yemen, it's much closer as well. The distance to Afghanistan is just longer. And so, yes, manned and unmanned flights are possible with strikes, but it's going to take longer to get there. And as you noted, without forward observers on the ground, it's not just that the bad guys might get away. There's also the increased risk of civilian casualties. This is something that, obviously U.S. policymakers and planners have factored into their decisions. I have no inside knowledge, but I'm reasonably confident that people in the intelligence community are working on building new assets on the ground right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the counterterrorism activities that occur in Afghanistan, going forward, occur under what is called Title 50, which governs the CIA, as opposed to Title 10 of the US Code, which governs the US military, which is to say, I think we might see more intelligence paramilitary type of CT activities in the country rather than just the type of military force that we've seen in the past. With all of that said, knowing that we are blinder than we were in the past and that it is going to be harder to strike targets, I would return to the fact that we are also much more aware of what to look for than we were in the past. And we have a lot of other defensive measures that are in place. And we have a global intelligence capability and global partners that we've worked to put together, including through efforts to counter foreign terrorist fighters that came out of, the influx of people to Iraq and Syria after the Islamic State took Mosul and declared its caliphate, right? All of those policies and practices that were put in place can be adapted or leveraged as well, which none of this is to say that we should not be taking the threat seriously. It is to say that we are in a very, very different place now than we were, 10 and certainly 20 years ago.
All right. And Medea, just, turning to, obviously the US-Pakistani relations have been very complicated for a long time. Pakistan government and ISI, the intelligence service military, had relationships with the Taliban going back almost 30 years now themselves. Three governments recognized the Taliban when they existed in the 90s, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Pakistanis, and they were the last ones to officially break ties with them after 9/11. But despite those complications, the United States needed their assistance militarily in other ways with Afghanistan, but probably one of the biggest, most frightening concepts was the fact that Pakistan's a nuclear power, and wanting to make sure that, as bad as the government, as duplicitous as the government might be, that Pakistan or some of those nuclear weapons couldn't slip out or kind of slip in the hands of somebody else. How concerned are you that you mentioned the Haqqani network, the TTP, the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban become inspired and hopeful, and they see Afghanistan as a rallying point, as a beacon? And what's the Pakistani government thinking now about maybe partially kind of this monster that's made, and what are the chances of a threat to the government itself from their own extremists?
Sure. I mean, I think the government is aware that the TTP is regrouping and it's posing a threat. The government is increasingly, and it did so. It's pointed fingers outward. It's pointed fingers at India for funding the Taliban, and it's really upped that rhetoric in recent months. And so, it's aware of this threat, and it wants to make sure that it's not owning this threat in front of its citizenry. It's sort of pushing it to it being India's fault. So that's sort of how it's dealing with its citizenry in terms of the threat, which is an important point to note. But I think the chief of army staff, General Bajwa, and the DJISI, I think quite directly in a recent briefing that they had with Parliament. It was a closed door briefing, but news of it leaked out. Basically said, look, we should be scared. The Afghan Taliban and the TTP are ideological twins, basically two sides of the same coin. And definitely the National Security Advisor, the DJISI, when they were here last month, talked about this as well. So they're aware of the threat. However, they've dealt with the threat before, right? So their way of dealing with the threat is kinetic force. The military in Pakistan is strong, and it is able to take on the TTP. I think the big difference between the Afghan Taliban and the TTP, essentially, I mean, one can think of their goals really being the same, right? They want to take over the country. They want basically this version of Sharia that they think is the right ideological version in their mind to be imposed on the country. They don't think the Afghan Taliban didn't think that the Ghani government was Islamic enough, and clearly the TTP doesn't think Pakistan's civilian military establishment is the right government to rule the country. But the difference in Pakistan's case is that Pakistan's establishment and military is strong, and it's able to keep them at bay kinetically. Now it's always going to be a moving target. The main problem in Pakistan is this refusal to acknowledge the fact that the roots of the TTP's extremism are local. It is extremism that the state has fostered over the last more than 70 years now through its policies. So that's why, because they again will always have sort of this support coming in from the population, because the population will buy the TTP's propaganda. If the TTP says the government is not Islamic enough, there are elements of the population that believe that. When I did interviews of students in Pakistan schools, back when the TTP was attacking, was at sort of its height in 2013, 2014, some of them would say, look, the TTP is only engaging in this because of the fact that our government is allied with the US in this war on terror, and that's a mistaken alliance. So that's, what some of them would say. Some of them would point fingers at India, but then others would also say, they only want to impose, an Islamic government in Pakistan, and that's justified, right? And that's because the government has, made sort of ingrained this in the population. And so, I think when one steps back, one can be pretty secure about Pakistan's ability to counter this group kinetically, as it did in the 2015 timeframe onwards. But in terms of the countering its narrative, countering its ideological appeal, it doesn't do that at all. And one worries about, the TTP has congratulated the Afghan Taliban for its victory. Other terrorist groups in Pakistan have as well. But also one worries about Islamist parties, as well as, fundamentalist groups that are even to the right of those Islamist parties. There's one called the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, that are not terrorists, but are certainly fundamentalists, and those groups certainly will be emboldened, and that can sort of threaten this line that the government walks. Right, the government uses Islam when it needs to, but still functions as a constitutional parliamentary democracy. That can all be threatened a little bit, and so Pakistan, it's tough times ahead for Pakistan.
And Stephen, Sally, wasn't that long ago, the American administrations were trying to deal with ISIS. It still exists, obviously. But part of the reason it was able to explode and gain so much momentum was because in Syria, in eastern Syria, northern Syria during the civil war, in kind of ungoverned or poorly governed spaces, they basically had a degree of freedom to do as they wish. Are you concerned about that happening in Afghanistan? And perhaps there being areas of Afghanistan that even the Taliban can't control, that ISIS-K can kind of grow and kind of metastasize again? And do you expect a big flood of kind of foreign fighters or people inspired by the ideology of ISIS or even Al Qaeda to come to Afghanistan now? Sorry, you're muted for a second.
I've only been doing Zoom for 18 months, so of course I was muted when I started to respond. We're already seeing on some jihadist social media and forums calls for individuals to go to Afghanistan. So I think it's reasonable to expect that some foreign fighters will at least try to go there. I don't think we're going to see anything like the influx that we saw to Iraq and Syria. Could be wrong about that, but that was tens of thousands coming in, and I think we're unlikely to see that kind of an influx to Afghanistan. And quite frankly, I don't think the Taliban is necessarily, looking for that right now. They may ideologically, and because of bonds of loyalty, have clearly not broken ties with Al Qaeda, but I don't think that they necessarily want to set up the same sort of terrorist Disneyland that they had in the 1990s, where there's just camps popping up everywhere. With that said, I do think there is the danger that as the Taliban struggles to consolidate territory, that ISK is able to operate. But ISK was already, able to operate to some degree. U.S. pressure obviously contained it. I think there's a large question about whether the Islamic State's affiliate in the region is going to be focused on striking the US and Europe, or whether there's going to be more focus, quite frankly, on fighting the Taliban and trying to spread regionally. Historically, IS affiliates, they've been open to both, but the focus has been more on consolidating territory and building, small areas where they have control. And so I think the regional threat is certainly going to be larger than the international threat, which doesn't mean the international threat can be ignored, but I think the regional threat is going to be is going to be greater. And quite frankly, I think there's a regional threat, that we're talking about Afghanistan, but we're also talking about Pakistan. A lot of members of, ISK are disaffected Pakistani Taliban members. And so we may see them operating on both sides of the border. If I may, there's one other point that I'd love to add with regard to your question to Medea, in terms of how the Pakistanis respond to this. And that's to note, one, to reinforce, I think, the analysis that Pakistan has not entirely quelled the terrorist threat, but it is in a much better position, in terms of the number of attacks that are occurring right now than it was, 10 years ago. Medea has written about this, and I've commented this and others, that the threat is more of a baseline level of extremism permeating throughout society than it is from a TTP that is able to necessarily gain the type of strength that it had, at its peak. And the other thing I would say is, and the reason I think that's important to remember is, I think that Pakistan did a very good job at some points of hyping that threat to its nuclear weapons from terrorists to try to keep US pressure at bay. And so I think we need to be mindful of that and not be so fearful that Pakistan is so fragile that it's going to collapse, and that keeps us from holding Pakistan accountable, especially given the important role that it is going to be playing, as a chief interlocutor with the Taliban.
Just turn to the audience questions. Now I'm just going to ask two questions. They're related, and either of you feel free to answer as you can. Maybe just a little bit briefly. I'll try to get to all the audience questions. TD asks, do you think China and Pakistan will have a lot of influence in the new Taliban administration? And then related to that, Richard asks, from the Chinese government perspective, what are the upsides to the United States leaving Afghanistan, and what are the downsides?
Sure, I'm happy to kick it off, or Medea, defer to you if you prefer.
Sure, kick it off, and then I'll jump in.
Chime in. Sure. So, I mean, in terms of influence, yeah, that's a very easy question to answer. Yes, China and Pakistan will both have influence with the Taliban. Pakistan has been providing various types of support and sanctuary for 2 decades now. More than that, provided it during the 90s as well. And China has been cultivating a relationship with the Taliban for a decade. And it was also, it had parallel track diplomacy where it was, it continued to try to have good diplomatic relations with the Ghani administration while simultaneously cultivating relations with the Taliban. And it was pretty quick to break with the Ghani administration when it saw where things were going, and to try to consolidate that relationship with the Taliban. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be concerns in Beijing about Taliban behavior. It does seem that the sense out of Beijing, at least from those who know far more about where Chinese thinking on these issues are than I do, is that the consensus view, or at least the dominant view, is that the Taliban is overall more pragmatic now than it was at the time of 9/11, and so that the Chinese can work with that. In terms of the benefits, I think that China, and quite frankly, China will work with Russia to try to keep the United States out and to exert more influence in the region. This is a way to reduce U.S. influence in their near abroads. And to the degree that the Chinese can attempt to position the U.S. withdrawal and the consequences that followed. And again, I want to be clear that I am one of those who's in the camp that, I think this was a slow motion train wreck that had, a lot of the variables that contributed to the type of collapse that we saw had been building for a long time. Even if the withdrawal was the trigger. They will bill this as a failure of sort of the US approach to nation building, and a boon for their model, right? They're much more agnostic about how their partners behave in terms of human rights and other things like that. and they will, I think they will attempt to capitalize on this, to show the benefits of their approach. And there are resources that they may seek to exploit there as well. Although I'm skeptical that they are as robust as some think, or at least their capability to do so is as robust as some think. But there are potential economic advantages in terms of transit corridors and things like that also. So overall, I think, yes, this is the Chinese will seek to benefit in various ways from this.
Great. You?
Sure. I'll just add a couple of points on what China's interests in Afghanistan are. Many point to potential economic interests, but at this point, China's interests really currently are security interests. It wants to basically secure its interests in the region, which primarily currently are in Pakistan. The China-Pakistan relationship is strong. They call each other iron brothers. China has invested a huge deal in Pakistan, right? So it has the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the flagship of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it wants to make sure that Afghan soil is not used to attack Chinese targets, Chinese economic targets, Chinese workers in Pakistan. And the TTP has attacked those targets. And so, China's interests are basically, securing those investments and its workers in Pakistan. And then it also wants to keep make sure that the Taliban keeps the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, at bay, basically prevents it from attacking China. So that's sort of its security interests. And I agree with Stephen. I think it's going to use the U.S. retreat, the manner of the withdrawal, the scenes at the Kabul airport, the evacuation attempts. It has, and it's going to use these for its own rhetoric and showing that for its own propaganda, showing that it's a better superpower, if you will, than the superpower than the U.S., right? So that's sort of China's incentives here and where it's going. The one other thing I'll add is that we've the U.S. government and other Western governments have talked a lot about how the international community can use various levers at our disposal, aid, sanctions, etc., to try to moderate the Taliban. But it's important to note that there are a whole set of countries that may recognize the Taliban without the Taliban moderating itself, right? And that includes China, that includes Russia, includes Pakistan, includes Iran, Turkey, Qatar, all of these countries. And so that limits the effects that a U.S. or a non-U.S. recognition will have on the Taliban, right? And certainly China's aid is something that the Taliban will want to cultivate and may get, regardless of how non-inclusive they are. And in some ways, the China-Pakistan duo comes a little bit as a package deal for the Taliban, and that's to its advantage.
And if each of you just may give relatively brief answers, I'm going to try and get to as many of the audience questions as possible. And if you both want to answer any of these or just one of them, that's fine. Alan asks, with a 20-year history of Afghan exposure to Western ideas, especially related to women's issues, and the younger perhaps being less religious, will the Taliban be able to govern, or will the administration rely upon physical force? Stephen, you want to start, or just do you more in your area?
You want me to start? I'm happy to go ahead, but I went first last time, so if you prefer.
Okay.
I can take a brief stab at this and then toss it over to you. I think we've already seen that the Afghanistan of 2021 looks very different from the Afghanistan of 1996. When the Taliban took over last time, and you've seen protests, you've seen very brave women on the streets of Kabul, but also other parts of Afghanistan, and the Taliban have relied on force to try to quell these protests. They've beaten up journalists, and we've seen those pictures that have come out. And then actually, just yesterday, the newly appointed interim Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani basically announced that a ban on protests. They said no more spontaneous protests. All protests will have to have their topics and their slogans approved by the Taliban. That and there will be harsh consequences for those who don't obey this new law. And so that basically means that it's turning into a repressive regime, right? But it's going to have and really, I mean, frankly, that's not surprising at all to me, and I think anyone who expected any different from the Taliban, can see that any expectation of moderation was too good to be true. It was a pipe dream, frankly. But I still think that the Afghanistan of today, protests may not be the way that people will try or will be able to be heard, but there are other ways. They're very connected in terms of social media. They're connected to the rest of the world, and so there are going to be other ways that they make their voices heard. And so, governing is not going to be an easy task for the Taliban now. It wasn't even in 96 to 2001, but it's going to be far harder now for the Taliban.
I would just very, very briefly note, in agreement with much of what Medea said, especially on the social, right? I mean, there's several things that are different, right? As you noted in the question, the exposure that people have had over the last 20 years. I think the international community is paying more attention. But the Taliban is also going to face a lot of the challenges that a lot of would-be repressive regimes face, which is, right, what social media provides in terms of organizing capability and things of that nature. And we're already seeing that as well. What we're also seeing is the Taliban attempting to try to regulate social media, regulate what could be shared on Twitter, what can be posted on Facebook, the type of messaging that could be done. And I think one of the open questions is going to be not whether they have the intent to be repressive, but whether they have the capability to be repressive, right, given a lot of the new technologies that are available as well.
All right, and just kind of related to those questions again, let's kind of maybe combine these. Jim asks, is there anything further, I suppose, beyond what you've said, especially Medea, that explains the appeal of the Taliban? And Diane asks, will the Taliban be able to create a viable government that'll be viewed as an improvement for many on the President Ghani's administration? Medea, do you want to start? Or?
Sure. I mean, I think to some there might be an ideological appeal of the sort of version of religion that the Taliban promises. But I think one really needs to think about this in terms of sort of the relative peace that the Taliban sort of promise if people basically stay out of their way and follow exactly the kind of repressive regime and the policies of the repressive regime. So if women now actually don't go to work, the Taliban have asked that women stay home because of security reasons, and so on. And if all of that, if they do all of what the Taliban wants, they actually, can have a more peaceful existence. And the appeal perhaps is less conflict, right? And though all of their other freedoms, that they wanted, the freedom to work, the freedom to go to school, the freedom to have the kind of healthcare that they wanted, goes away. So peace is one, and relative security in this kind of obviously not free environment. And then I think the Ghani government had not endeared itself to many Afghans. The corruption is well understood. The fleeing, frankly, was a stunning act of cowardice on the part of Ashraf Ghani, but I think may not have surprised many Afghans who had grown very disillusioned with the leadership of the government over the last few years, and in fact, just thinking about the Afghan government over the past 2 decades. So there wasn't there isn't a viable counter to the Taliban that has actually endeared itself to the Afghan public. But that doesn't mean that Afghans like, the average Afghan likes the Taliban, right? It's just that there isn't a viable model that offers them security and freedom and prosperity.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of data points that also help flesh this out, especially in terms of, Medea's point about a lot of people just wanting peace. And that is that, the Taliban are harsh, they are cruel, but they are also by and large consistent. And in a conflict zone, people tend to crave, consistency. There's plenty of counterinsurgency theory about this. But the idea is essentially, it's the rules of the road. You want to know what's going to get me killed and what's not going to get me killed. And the Taliban was pretty consistent about that, including in the areas where they exerted control. Whereas Afghan forces were far more inconsistent. And quite frankly, U.S. forces were in some cases inconsistent as well, right? A lot of civilian casualties resulted from U.S. airstrikes in particular, especially during, when Trump ramped up over the last several years. And so, that level of inconsistency, where you didn't know what to expect from the government and U.S. forces, whereas from the Taliban, you knew what to expect. In a conflict zone, that has a certain level of appeal, right? That has nothing to do with ideology. I would also note that I think there have been areas of Afghanistan that have been under Taliban control now for quite some time. And so the idea that they are just coming to power now to control the whole country is not necessarily correct, right? They've had control in certain areas for some time. And in some places, nothing is going to change, right? And the final point that I would make is that, when one thinks about the questions of corruption and governance and consistency and all of that, in some of the areas, it's not just that people wanted peace, it's that the things that were that U.S. forces were there that were fighting for, which I think were all very, very noble goals, weren't necessarily things that were appealing to parts of the rural population, for whom life hasn't changed that much in 20 years, other than, again, the fact that you could be killed in a random airstrike. And so, we have to factor that in as well. The view, and there's I think some good writing that's coming out on that now, that the view from Kabul is very, very different from the view outside Kabul, in terms of what people value and how they feel about what is and is not worth an ongoing fight.
All right, and maybe just very, very briefly, I know it's hard because it's something each of you have studied for years and years, and I encourage the audience to look at some of the excellent articles by both of you on each subject. But maybe, Medea, just very, very brief points. We've tried military strategies, intelligence work. We've also tried nation building in Afghanistan. what are just 2 or 3 points you would say would be a good way to kind of try to combat or reduce extremism? And then Stephen, on the kind of more strategic and tactical side of it, how does the United States need to refocus its counterterrorism efforts, especially now with kind of increasing need to focus on Russia and China? And
you like me to go first?
sure, yeah.
Sure. Okay. Sure. So I will try to be brief on this. You know, I've written quite a bit on this, and to me, one of the misses of the last 20 years is the fact that we have focused so much on countering terrorism that we have lost sight of the countering extremism part of the equation. And the approach to countering extremism has been lacking, as well as misguided. And to me, you know, one of the ways of reducing the appeal of these groups and is for the population, you know, and this is not, I'm not talking just about the US population, I'm talking about the population, or, you know, populations around the world. You know, you can think about Afghanistan, Pakistan, you can think about, you know, Nigeria, is for a population to have, you know, an ability to counter this propaganda. And that ability, frankly, just comes from critical thinking, right? To be able to counter extremist propaganda, you need to be able to think critically and independently. And a lot of that can be fostered through a sound, solid education system. There are other goals, you know, there's kind of thinking about students as global citizens, right? Rather than just myopic, exclusionary, intolerant, you know, inculcating exclusion and intolerance in via schooling systems. But schools and curricula are a great venue to actually teach critical thinking. And, you know, one can think about teaching critical thinking to adults as well, through, you know, other ways of doing this, you know, through the media, for instance. And that, you know, in this sort of generation, right, if we're thinking about extremist propaganda that is spread through social media, it's spread through WhatsApp, it comes through fake news. Having a population that's able to counter these things is extremely useful. So I think both teaching tolerance, you know, teaching kind of this inclusive view of the world is important, but also just basic skills to be able to decipher what's propaganda and what's not, or to be able to counter them with your own reasoning is very, very useful. And, you know, ultimately, this is something that countries have to do, right? So you know, we sitting in the US can't impose an education system on Pakistan. You know, that's not going to be received well. So the country has to decide that it has to do this. And so, you know, there are ways that one can think about. I wrote a paper on this earlier this year. I mean, one can think about, you know, sort of an approach that comes from the UN, where it's part of, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals, where you sort of try to get countries to sign on to a more inclusive kind of educational system. I'll stop there.
Okay, so very quickly, I mean, I would say that, you know, we need to have, and I think we are already seeing, rebalancing in 3 areas. The first, you know, is that rebalancing towards great power competition, or rather strategic competition over counterterrorism. You know, we've been too much CT and not focused enough on strategic competition. I would add to that also climate change, pandemics, right? There are a whole lot of non-traditional threats out there that we need to be taking much more seriously. So that's the first rebalance that has to happen. The second is, I would say that we actually, you know, we're talking a lot about, obviously, it's the anniversary of 9/11, we're talking about Al Qaeda, we're talking about ISIS, we're talking about Afghanistan. The second rebalance that we need, which thankfully is also, I think, underway, is away from the threat from international terrorism and towards the threat from actors who are you know, who are domestic. In particular, the white identity movement, the extreme right, militia movements. If one looks at the attacks that have occurred over the last several years, one looks at sort of at the what appear to be the largest threats currently from terrorism, they are domestic, not international. And so we need to be rebalancing in that direction, not taking our eye off the ball in terms of Al Qaeda, ISIS, and others, but recognizing that there are actors here at home about whom we need to be concerned. And then finally, insofar as we are focused internationally, being more focused on using non-military tools. And that means, yes, development assistance and efforts to counter the narrative. But also, again, I come back to what I said at the beginning, relying on our intelligence capabilities, on our homeland security, on our partners where we can. We've built a very, very robust counterterrorism infrastructure. It has been overly militarized for the last 15 to 20 years. But it also has a lot of other components on which we can rely, where use of force is a last resort rather than the first tool we reach for in the toolbox. Doesn't mean we don't use force. It just means we play defense as much as we can. The final thing that I just want to say to sort of close out is, as we think about risks from terrorism, I think it's important to keep in mind that, there's this sense that we are accepting more risk, and people tend to stop there. And I think that that's the wrong way of looking at it. We are accepting more risk from terrorism to buy down risk in other areas. And for the last 20 years, we've been accepting risk in a lot of other areas because of our focus on counterterrorism. And so now what we're seeing is an evening out, right? And I think that's important to keep in mind. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what policymaking in the national security arena is. It's adjudicating risk. So, so that's sort of where we are. But we've come a long way from where we were on 9/11. The threat will continue to evolve, and our response will need to continue to evolve with it.
All right. Well, again, and related to that, invite you all to join us September 30th when we host Michael O'Hanlon for his discussion of U.S. grand strategy, the art of war in an age of peace, dealing with a lot of the topics that Stephen just mentioned with regards to major power conflict, but also how do we address pandemics, climate change, cyber threats. I want to thank Stephen Tango so much for joining us, and Medea Afzal so much to have you both. It was excellent, and we'd love to have you sometime here again, hopefully in person in Houston, maybe next year. And thank you both for all the work that you do, and we look forward to keeping in touch. And thank you all at home for watching.